Um, it is wonderful to join you all again. And so here we are now returning to the house after after about 10 years or so of the Time Passes section. And one of the things we may want to talk about today or next time is the title of the sections. We had the window, and now after Time Passes, this section is called the Lighthouse. And it's a return after time and really the inhuman powers of nature almost destroyed the world of the window, only to have it rescued at the last moment by the very human Mrs. McNabb and her colleague, Mrs. Beck. So it's an interesting, just an interesting kind of miraculous resurrection that they're able to effect that allows us to now have this return. And as I was reading it, I am sure that all of you were thinking about the optimist's daughter as well. You know, when that return to the house after time passes, it's not the same. And so much of this section is about the fact that it's not the same, and really that same contemplation about loss and absence and how we come to terms with that, how we try to make sense of it as survivors. And this is the part of the novel that I think is also so clearly and explicitly about the creation of art and the relationship between art and absence and loss. And so we have that kind of contemplation running through this. I guess the other comment I wanted to make, a couple more comments before starting the discussion. It struck me this time, and I had not noticed this before. I think this is the result of slow reading with a group of skilled and thoughtful readers, that there's a kind of a rhythm in terms of the sections of the Lighthouse that we didn't see in the same way in the previous two sections, where we do keep kind of moving from, the house and primarily Lily Briscoe's point of view to the boat, and to the son and daughter's point of view. And also once again, Mr. Ramsay plays a very large role throughout this section. He is, you know, in some ways, I think he is the lighthouse, or he is the lightning rod in some ways that we keep seeing everyone's reaction to. So that was, I just had not noticed the way in which before this section of the novel has a kind of a clear delineation from section to section about where we are and about whose thoughts we're going to be in primarily. And I also just want to say this has one of the funniest passages in the novel to me on page 154. This is Lily Briscoe at the bottom of 153, when Mr. Ramsay wants her sympathy and is so sad and heartbroken and is just insisting that she pay attention to him, and she cannot give him what he wants until she looks down and cries, "What beautiful boots," she exclaimed. And on the next page, she thinks they had reached, she felt, a sunny island where peace dwelt, sanity reigned, and the sun forever shone, the blessed island of good boots. And it just struck me that the blessed island of good boots is what we're all always looking for in a difficult and awkward conversation. We're always looking for that kind of blessed island. And it's just, I thought, such an example of the kind of humor that runs throughout this novel, and that runs throughout this novel in a satiric way, often having to do with relationships between men and women. And there is so much irony throughout here also in her view of men and women and their relationships. But, right, and you're right, Monica, he has a system for tying shoes. And he shows her and he tells her that she doesn't know how to do it properly, but that he will show her. And he ties and reties her shoes 3 times, which again is emblematic of Mr. Ramsay in this novel. But I wanted to start the discussion with the fact that Time Passes ends with the exclamation, awake. And it's Lily Briscoe sitting up in bed, awake, her first morning back on the island. And the lighthouse then begins with Lily Briscoe's question, what does it mean then? What can it all mean? And so I wanted to talk about what you make of this, of this transition that Woolf has given us, from the kind of poetic intensity of Time Passes to this sudden return. Any thoughts on that? Monica.
Well, I'll start. I have lots of thoughts, as I'm sure you would imagine. You know, something, the Lighthouse section, both it starts with this hugely abstract question, right? What does it all mean? What can it all mean? It even at one point goes out and asks the question, what is the purpose of life, or what is the meaning of life? But she goes straight from what does it all mean to a cup of coffee, right? And then like the whole, like what actually allows her to have sympathy for Mr. Ramsay is boots. Yes. And so there's this really interesting, another rhythm of like going from this huge abstract philosophical questions to the really concrete, and maybe that is the answer of the big philosophical questions, is a cup of coffee or a pair of good boots and a good system for tying your boots.
Right. There's another point at which that's so similar is after Lily finds herself at the end of section 2 on page 156. She's ashamed of herself. She's ashamed of being irritable. She thinks, what an extraordinary face. The gate banged. So there's a kind of intentional puncturing of so many of these philosophical passages that Woolf lets her characters indulge in those, and then brings them very sharply back to a sensory material world over and over again. And we see that pattern repeated. Harriet.
Yeah, I thought a lot about the comedy. I thought a lot about the big questions. We've been seeing those questions for a while. They're all over the second section as well as the third, but I'm also struck by how I'm continue to see what I called, I think, our first session, this whiplash of change. About what you feel, what you think. And I'm not sure if I'm looking at the complexity of people's feelings, emotions, or the irrationality of them, the change of mutability of them. But, to get from her anger with Mr. Ramsay over his demand for sympathy and his exactingness and his performativity of both masculinity and his decrepitude, and his sorrow. I have a very strong feeling that I'm looking at the same kind of performativity of masculinity that I am in Welty's Delta Wedding.
Absolutely. I think so.
But I'm just struck by the way in which she goes from that to the boots finds this irrelevant comment to make, which works somehow in a way that she doesn't expect it to, or he doesn't expect it to. He's suddenly completely disarmed and only interested in the story of telling his history of finding the perfect boot and how to tie it. And she feels sympathy, and she feels tenderness, and she cries. And I'm just looking at how often that's happening in this section, how often it's happened throughout the book. And I don't know if I'm looking at Welty's sense of opposites that are close together, or if we're looking at the complexity of human feeling, or if we're looking at the irrationality of it, that it's there's no good reason to feel sympathy for Mr. Ramsay at that moment, but she does. And the book has been full of that, and it's full of James and Cam's responses to their father are this is changeable and mutable. Yeah. So
So you are complexity and irrationality. Are those necessarily separate things?
maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joellen.
That sets me up beautifully. I was just going to point out that at the very beginning of today's readings, Lily is consumed with nothing. There's nothing that she feels, nothing around her. On the very next page, on page 146, about 2/3 of the way down, she had no attachment here. She felt no relations with it. Anything might happen. So nothing and anything do seem to be related in some way. And then a few lines down, she says it's not in the cupboard, it's on the landing, she's listening. Whatever did happen was a question, as if the link that usually bound things together had been cut, and they floated up here, down there, off anyhow. And I think we see this throughout this section, and I'm not going to comment on it right now, but the last paragraph in this section pulls all this together.
Yeah. Yes. And I think also, I think this is too a reference to time passes and World War I having really cut everything. And so those connections, I think, are hard to reestablish. And again, I think it's that sense of returning to a place, and a place that had so much meaning, and finding it so unfamiliar, and also familiar at the same time. So I think that it's we see that going on throughout this section, but we're seeing all of these rhythms. Let's follow up for a minute, since we've talked about it some. I mean, Mr. Ramsay, what do you make of people the changeability of people's views of Mr. Ramsay? And I think Harriet's right. I mean, I think there is such a performative quality to him. And at moments, he's very aware of playing the sad widower, the bereft widower, so that he can get attention. And we have that passage where he thinks about women, and he thinks how frustrating they are, because they have no, they're vague. Page 167, he talks about the women, they could not keep anything clearly fixed in their minds. And then he thinks about how important women are to him, and the fact that he really relies upon their sympathy and their attention. And we see, I love it, Cam and her brother agreeing to fight tyranny to the death, and then slowly being seduced to a kind of admiration for their father. Thoughts about that?
There's Cheryl.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking for a specific page. Cheryl, thank you. Thanks, Suzanne.
I just go back to the word that Harriet used, which is whiplash, because we get that in the characters' opinions all the time. Mrs. Ramsey loves and adores Mr. Ramsey, but then she can't stand to be near him. Cam, and I think it's very interesting that in time passes, Virginia Woolf leaves us with the youngest two children, Cam and James. Cam and James are going to fight the tyrant. And remember, way back in the beginning, if James had a knife, he would have, stabbed his father. But I think that Virginia Woolf is trying to come to terms with being able to have a positive and a negative view of a person or a society simultaneously. And that's why we see that in this novel so often, the back and forth, because you can hold these opposite views at the same time.
And I think we do. I mean, if you think of the people in your life with whom you're close, I think, none of us would say that our love, our respect, our affection for the people closest to us is consistent. But I don't know, but these are some pretty wild extremes at the same time, because we do have James, again, fantasizing if he had a knife that he would be attacking. Cheryl, yes, more to add there?
Oh, no, I'll put my,
okay.
sorry, okay.
Okay. Joellen.
I wonder whether we've said enough yet about the social conditions that are in which this novel is steeped. Mrs. Ramsey would have been a Victorian mother, like Virginia Woolf's mother. Lily Briscoe was part of, we call it now a first wave feminist movement, and the degrees to which they're semi-consciously aware of this, but also kind of fighting each other. There was a lot of whiplash for women, especially during this time. There's the homage to mothers, four mothers who represent the social conventions that women are trying to shed. We've commented on that quite a bit, but I think maybe it behooves us to remember the gendered conventions of the past that are trying to be shed. And Lily Briscoe comments on that very directly somewhere in this strategy. But for them, and we commented, or I heard in recordings, I've missed for a while, but people have really commented on Mrs. Ramsey's strategies for maintaining her dignity and a kind of hold on herself. And so I think that some of the whiplash can be explained by that, and possibly even feelings about Mr. Ramsey as well.
Well, right, because I think that we've seen Lily Briscoe trying to resist some of those, the traditional roles for women, and feeling, she says that, thank God she escaped getting married, as Mrs. Ramsey so wanted her to. But there's a funny passage of where she's setting up her easel. And she's described as doing it. Oh, I wish I had marked that passage. It's on page 147. She fetched herself a chair. She pitched her easel with her precise old maidish movements on the edge of the lawn, not too close to Mr. Carmichael. And I found myself thinking, wait, whose viewpoint is that? Her old maidish movements. But we have, I think, Joellen, you're right. I mean, we've seen the links that Mrs. Ramsay, that the strategy she had to have to kind of preserve some of herself, especially in the face of her husband's needs and desires, and her refusal to tell him she loves him. And we've seen Lily Briscoe trying to resist what she sees as the kind of social imperative for her as a woman to take care of Mr. Ramsay. And then with the children, I mean, they're subject to that kind of hierarchy within the family, subject to the father, but they're trying to resist it. So I think we do see a lot of those tensions. Suzanne.
The scholar John Briggs, writing about creativity, says that the ability to accept simultaneous opposition is at the heart of creativity. And here we have, simultaneous opposition all over the place. Our Weltys would put it, all of the opposites on earth are close together. And toward Mrs. Ramsay as well as Mr. Ramsay. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. She was wrong about Paul and Minta. Yeah, look here. I got it right. She didn't get it right. And then breaking into tears at the loss of Mrs. Ramsay. And,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and so that her reaction to both Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay is filled with that kind of duality, which I'm like you, Susan. I think it's at the heart of our responses, especially to the people closest to us.
Yes, right. Oh, yes, I can be far more consistent to people I don't know very well.
Right.
Exactly. Cheryl.
Okay, so first I want to give a applause to writers like Woolf, Welty, and Faulkner, who were writing and describing human emotion and psychology before the first DSM was even published in like the 50s or 60s, whenever it was. And then to follow up on, also thank you, Dr. Mars, for the John Briggs reference. I'll look that up. But to follow back up on what Joellen was saying about the advent or birth of feminism, think back to when Lily Briscoe was saying one must, and that was the first painting she was doing of Mrs. Ramsay holding James while Mrs. Ramsay was in the window. Okay. And then another image that I like is from back in the first part was Prue leapt into the air, catching something with her left hand. Right. That's another thing of early feminism to me. And Cam, she's defiant. She's walking through the meadow with her stick or whatever she's doing, and she's not paying attention to anyone. She won't take heed to anyone. And then when Minta loses the brooch, it's her grandmother's brooch that she's she loses. So it's another tie to what the older tradition was versus what can I do for myself, the new woman? What will the new woman's age be?
And Minta loses it when she has gone off alone with Paul, which again,
She should not have done, right.
order, was breaking some of the rules. And in the window, Mrs. Ramsay has a moment looking at her daughters where she thinks that they're going to have opportunities for a different kind of life than she's had an opportunity for. And she says, something about, they may go to Paris. So the novel is really set at at a real threshold moment that was also very much related to World War One, which represented a period of opening up for women, simply because the men weren't there anymore. And so, and women were called upon, but also invited to take up roles that were different. And of course, that's what Virginia Woolf and her sister were doing. But it did take the death of her father for them to be able to move out on their own. And even then, they were wrestling with the strictures placed on them by their stepbrothers. So I think that's exactly right. That's so much of what's going on, especially with masculinity, with male and female roles in this novel, have to do with that crucial time period. Harriet.
Yeah, I wanted to address your question about whose point of view do we have when she thinks about being a skimpy old maid. Is that she's constantly moving from her thoughts to seeing herself externally and how other people see her. So I'm in 37. In the chapter 37, in the final chapter that we read, no one had seen her step off the strip of board into the waters of annihilation. She remained a skimpy old maid, a paintbrush, and she is full of the self-doubts about her painting, her creativity. It would be hung in the attic. It would be rolled up and flung under a sofa. Yet to engage a little bit in that whiplash myself, I think that these are moments when she has a kind of commonality with Mr. Ramsay. This is they're opposites, but they're also the same. His doubts about his reception and his and whether he is and when she thinks about his face, that his face has been made by thoughts about the table, that kitchen table, and her sense that it is that he has doubts about whether he can capture it or whether he can understand it, or is the table there. That sense of being engaged in a adventure that is larger than the self, and wondering about whether you're capable of it and how people perceive your creativity.
And I think that connection between Lily Briscoe and Mr. Ramsay is a wonderful one to make, because I think that they are connected in both I was going to say in artistic endeavors of a sort. I mean, Mr. Ramsay is an intellectual, but in the Lighthouse, we come to see being an artist from a number of different perspectives, because Lily Briscoe recognizes that Mrs. Ramsay is an artist. And so I did, but that passage, so she has that awareness of herself. And I thought it was interesting then that on page 150 in the first sentence of section 2, it's echoed in a way by Mr. Ramsay. She seemed to have shriveled slightly, he thought. She looked a little skimpy, wispy, but not attractive. He liked her. And then on 157, and this again is in Lily's perspective, but we've heard this several times and we haven't talked about it. This is at the top of 157, which is in section 3. There was something. She stood screwing up her little Chinese eyes in her small puckered face. Something she remembered in the relations of those lines cutting across, slicing down, and in the mass of the hedge. Her little Chinese eyes. I'm also very very curious and puzzled by those. But
Mhm.
okay, Cheryl.
Guys, I am so sorry. I'm joining from my phone today. I did not mean to have my hand up right
Okay,
now.
Joellen.
That section that you were just looking at, Suzanne, on page 157, by the end of the first paragraph, the top of the page, Lily gets to the point where she's thinking about knots. And that echoes, of course, brings back the knots that
Yes.
Mr. Ramsey seems just to be tying and untying to prove that she's a woman and can't do it. But she recognizes that there's a knot in her mind and that she will untie the knot in imagination.
Right.
And I think that's part of this whole sequence of Lily Briscoe thinking about Mr. Ramsey, and she sees him. And you've talked in the past about looking, and she
Yes.
sees that doubt that you were talking about, and she picks up on the following page. I think it's page 156. That there's a sudden shift in him, that he too can have whiplash. He can suddenly recover from the things that are making him rage around, doubt, worrying about his kitchen table, and recover vitality and interest in ordinary human things. And we've seen that before. I think it's William Banks who tells about the vision of the chicks and the hens, which
Yes.
bring Mr. Ramsey back down to earth. So, and before all this, Lily Briscoe has commented on something like, there was no helping Mr. Ramsey on his journey. And I think they're both on journeys of a sort. And she may have been identifying with him in part because of that.
Suzanne.
I was thinking about Lily's painting and thinking, oh, well, it'll have to be rolled up and be stuck under the bed someplace, and it's going to fail. And she thinks at another point, this is on 158, this form, were it only the shape of a white lampshade looming on a wicker table, roused one to perpetual combat, challenged one to fight and which one was bound to be worsted. And I think of Audubon thinking, his painting of the bird will never be one with the real thing.
Right.
Nevertheless, he's going to paint it. And Lily, knowing that what she's trying to paint, what she's seeing and what she's feeling is never going to be adequate, but you do it anyway, and that art will survive. And so I love that. But I'm wondering about those little Chinese eyes, because that's Mrs. Ramsey's phrase, isn't it?
Yes.
Mrs. Ramsey thinks of her with little Chinese eyes, and it's almost as if she's casting herself in terms which she knows Mrs. Ramsey has thought of her.
Well, and there is some very interesting scholarship about colonialism and this novel. And so her little Chinese eyes come up in that context. And also, I mean, there's a lot to be said about colonialism and the empire in this novel. But I'm so curious about that moment. These moments of Lily Briscoe really looking at herself from the outside. But Suzanne, to get back to that passage that you picked out, I think it's just an absolutely magnificent passage about being an artist. But actually, sometimes I read this and I think, oh yeah, that's what it feels like trying to start an article, a scholarly article even, when you are trying to set out, you've got that blank page, you have a concept, but trying to translate it into language or trying to translate something into paint. And I love it when she talks about, for what could be more formidable than that space. Here she was again, she thought, stepping back to look at it, drawn out of gossip, out of living, out of community with people, into the presence of this formidable, ancient enemy of hers, this other thing, this truth, this reality, which suddenly laid hands on her, emerged stark at the back of appearances and commanded her attention. She was half unwilling, half reluctant. Why always be drawn out and haled away? Why not left in peace to talk to Mr. Carmichael on the lawn? And that seems to me another moment of Woolf's humor, because Mr. Carmichael doesn't talk to anyone on the lawn. That's not really an option. Teresa.
These discussions are good. My thoughts on Lily Briscoe is the entire time we've heard about her, from Mrs. Ramsey, from the beginning to the present of where we're at, they've all been negative. They've focused on her self-doubt. And I'm curious as to how the comments would be if she was married, or if she was engaged to be married, or if she had a romantic interest. And in contrast, if you look at Minta, the descriptions of her are so flattering by Mrs. Ramsey. And then I don't know where it is in the book, whether we've read it, but ultimately, I don't know if we're up to that point because I've read slightly further. Ultimately, the comparisons about Minta fall off the rails because her marriage with Paul Rayleigh didn't work out. So the ultimate question is, would the descriptions of Lily be better if she was hooked up or associated with a man? What do y'all think?
I think certainly Mrs. Ramsey's trying to push her that way, but there's that wonderful moment where in the window, Mrs. Ramsey compares to herself, Minta and Lily, and says that she thinks that in 10 years, Lily Briscoe is going to essentially wear better than Minta does, that because there's something to Lily that she has that is her own. So I think that, you know, that there's a gap between certainly how we see Lily and how Mrs. Ramsey sees her. Kelly.
As I'm reading through here, I wonder about Lily, and maybe it says somewhere, if she's ever really experienced loss before. I think it's part of the whiplash that she's surprised by how loss is coming to her in certain moments. At the bottom of page 178, she's talking about this essence of Mrs. Ramsey, and she said it had seemed so safe thinking of her. Then she begins to talk about ghost and air and nothingness. And so I think she's discovering how this emptiness can still be haunted by a person who is now absent, a ghost. And she has several words throughout here, essence and nothingness and ghost. And so I think she's learning the complications of grief, and they surprise her.
And I do love the way that Woolf really cuts straight to it on page 178. To want and not to have sent all up her body, a hardness, a hollowness, a strain. And then to want and not to have, to want and want, how that wrung the heart and wrung it again and again. I mean, that to me is just such a heartfelt cry. Harriet.
Yeah, I think going back to the issue of art and the way Woolf is so good on this topic, on the technicality of on how you get, or the problem of how you get from an idea that, you know, okay, you've got the idea, you know what you're going to do, and that's a triumph. But then there's a problem, which is how are you going to manipulate it in a medium, and can you do it? And what you know about the medium. And then too, I'm thinking about the rhythm of art, you know, that I'm looking at this passage. Then, as if some juice necessary for the lubrication of her faculties were spontaneously squirted, she began precariously dipping among the blues and umbers, moving her brush hither and thither, but it was now heavier and went slower, as if it had fallen into some rhythm which was dictated to her. She kept looking at the hedge, at the canvas, by what she by what the rhythm was strong enough to bear her along all with her. We've been paying attention to rhythm in various contexts, and now we're in the rhythm of art. But I'm also looking at the way in which her creative moments become a kind of loss of self, that she loses that perspective on how other people see her. She even loses herself. So certainly she was losing consciousness of outer things, and she lost consciousness of outer things and her name and her personality and her appearance, and whether Mr. Carmichael was there or not, her mind kept throwing up from its depths. And that sense, when you are in it, you don't know what is in the room. You don't know who you are. You know what you're creating. And I just think she's terrific on it.
Yeah.
Hardly ever is on what the process of creation is.
But I love what happens in the next paragraph. Charles Tansley used to say that, she remembered, women can't paint, women can't write. So part of what this creativity calls up for her is this memory of throwing stones and skipping stones with Charles Tansley. I mean, it's just that's such a fascinating transition to me. And so she's, and on to the next page, she said, she was highly conscious of that. Mrs. Ramsay, she thought, stepping back and screwing up her eyes. It must have altered the design a good deal when she was sitting on the step with James. There must have been a shadow. And then she goes back to thinking about herself and Charles and throwing stones. And then at the bottom, so it's, to me, what's going on through this section is just such a fascinating exploration of the relationship between creativity and art and memory.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah. I mean, this is a memory, and it starts off as a negative, but it turns into something positive. And it is, but it's also, I mean, I'm just thinking back across to The Optimist's Daughter and our sense that
exactly.
We're exploring memory and the relationship between memory and understanding, and memory and creativity. And so it's not out of the blue that she's remembering. She is also losing herself in her creation.
And at the bottom of page 160, she says that this memory has come back. It's something, this moment of friendship and liking, which had survived after all these years complete, so that she dipped into it to refashion her memory of him. And there it stayed in the mind, affecting one almost like a work of art. Like a work of art, she repeated, looking from her canvas to the drawing room steps and back again. And so really working with that connection of art being able to draw memory forward, but also, so art both recovers memory, but also makes one so acutely aware of the loss. Joellen.
My brain is going in circles and circles throughout this conversation, but I've been thinking about, looking back at where Lily Briscoe was talking about, the urgency of the moment on middle of page 178. The urgency of the moment always missed its mark. And somehow that linked up to me with the notion of beauty, which Teresa drew our attention to last time.
Right.
And
yes.
two-thirds of the way down the page in 177. And she's, I think that, was it William Banks, maybe in the middle of 177, was talking about the first time he saw Mrs. Ramsay, and she was astonishingly beautiful. But two-thirds of the way down, it says, but beauty was not everything. Beauty had this penalty. It came too readily, came too completely, it stilled life and froze it, almost like a Medusan effect there. But then we work through this text that you've been talking about, And it ends, the end of section 5 on page 180. By that point, and we've really been getting an merging of art and life through a lot of her thinking. I can't remember where it's pointed out that visions are broken into and they have to keep repeating themselves. They need to keep repeating. So on page 180, a third of the way down, she's thinking about the fact that even for elderly people, this was life, startling, unexpected, one unknown. But then after all of this thinking, a little after halfway down, she says, if you ask this question, two fully equipped human beings from whom nothing should be hid might speak, then beauty would roll itself up, the space would fill, those empty flourishes would form into shape. And there is, the optimist daughter just steps off so much in this passage, but beauty, lowercase b, filling this form, and through memory and art.
Well, and on page 179, I confess this made me think of the optimist daughter at the top of the page, where she's calling Mrs. Ramsey, and she said, ghost, air, nothingness, a thing you could play with easily and safely at any time of day or night. She had been that, and the she there is Mrs. Ramsey. And then suddenly she put her hand out and wrung the heart thus. Suddenly the empty drawing room steps, the frill of the chair inside, the puppy tumbling on the terrace, the whole wave and whisper of the garden became like curves and arabesques flourishing around a center of complete emptiness. What does it all mean? How do you explain it? She wanted to say. It calls always to me to mind the scene of Phil Hand coming as a ghost saying, I wanted it. It's that, Mrs. Ramsey reaching out and wringing the heart there. Suzanne.
I'm essentially reiterating what you and Harriet have already said, but it seems to me that we see art here as something where you totally lose yourself into the work. But in the process of losing yourself into the work, you sort of reclaim the past, and memory comes into play. And so both things are going on simultaneously. But I love the comparison to Phil Hand there. Yeah, thanks.
Harriet.
At the risk of assigning something to Eudora Welty that I may be making up because I'm remembering back decades. I think it's the essay in which she writes about Henry Green, where she says something like, art is always against death. That
is in that essay, yeah.
What can I say? Memory somehow triggered. But I think that we've been looking at memory, which it sometimes isn't even remembered, but is important. I mean, I'm thinking about James thinking about a flash of blue. We don't know what that memory is exactly. Maybe it's the scene with Mrs. Ramsey, but something traumatic that is for him a flash of blue, so something that isn't even remembered, but is memory that is being written, that the loss of it is being written against. I'm thinking, or painted against. I'm thinking of the way in which this painting, which will be abstract, maybe a smudge of green and blue, a shadow, rather than a mother and child, but that it will hold the memory of Mrs. Ramsey, and preserve her against loss, is somehow embedded in Lily's project.
And it's interesting too. This had not occurred to me until something you said, and I'm not even sure what it was, made me think of this. But in the novel, in this section, that as Lily is kind of going back and forth between these moments of artistic inspiration and then this experience of profound loss, and then kind of pulling back and then moving in again. It's the same motion of the boat that Cam and James and Mr. Ramsey and the McAllisters are on. You know, it catches the wind and then the wind dies. And that's all tied into the emotions they're experiencing as the voyage goes on as well. So it's a kind of a matter of fits and starts that, you know, get you partway there, and then, you know, you kind of step back, and then you have to work your way back into it.
And then that amazing sentence chapter, which is
I'm looking at it right now. Mr. McAllister's son, who doesn't have a name.
oh, but who cuts a square out of a living fish and throws that fish back into the water to
His body. Yes.
damaged, hurt, traumatized. Mhm.
Yes, and that comes immediately after the passage that Joellen was referring to. Beauty would roll itself up, the space would fill, those empty flourishes would form into shape. If they shouted it loud enough, Mrs. Ramsey would return. Mrs. Ramsey, she said aloud, Mrs. Ramsey. The tears ran down her face. McAllister's boy took one of the fish and cut a square out of its side to bait his hook with. The mutilated body, it was still alive, was thrown back into the sea. And that whole chapter is a parenthetical statement. So yeah, that's that's another of those sections that Woolf throws us with. Yes, Cheryl.
Okay, so here are some thoughts. The importance of beauty, and when we read Pride and Prejudice, how Mrs. Bennet said that she knew that Jane couldn't have been so beautiful for nothing. So that's a remark about beauty. And then Lily, during this grief episode, initially she's like, Mrs. Ramsey is the one to blame. It's her fault. It's her fault for all of this. But then after her kind of the scene, she says that she has Mrs. Ramsey to thank for all of this, which is another one of those opposites that we're dealing with. And then another opposite is when Woolf writes that she was half unwilling, half reluctant. And then I will close with when we find out that Mrs. Ramsey is dead, that Mr. Ramsey is opening his arms, but that throws back to, in the window, the hen and birds image of him walking and opening the hen opening its arms.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I'm always so struck by that, by Mrs. Ramsey's death being about Mr. Ramsey in that parenthetical intrusion. Okay, we don't have much time left, and we haven't talked about Cam and James and Mr. Ramsey on the boat much. So I wanted to just bring up on page 185, the wagon crushing a foot. And this is, and this has to do with James. And again, this is memory, and it's a memory. He's not even certain whose foot he was thinking of and in what garden did this happen. But he says, suppose then that as a child, sitting helpless in a perambulator or on someone's knee, he had seen a wagon crush ignorantly and innocently someone's foot. Suppose he had seen the foot first in the grass, smooth and whole, then the wheel, and then the same foot, purple, crushed. But the wheel was innocent. So now, when his father came striding down the passage, knocking them up early in the morning to go to the lighthouse, down it came over his foot, over Cam's foot, over anybody's foot. One sat and watched it.
Susan, I think that's in the reading for next time.
Oh, am I ahead? I'm so sorry.
I think you just jumped ahead, but it's a good start for next time.
Well, so pay attention to that wagon next time. Watch for that wagon. Keep your feet out of the road. Thoughts about, though, in our last few minutes, thoughts about what's happening on the boat and what's happening with James and Cam. And again, the interesting class issues having to do with the McAllisters at the very beginning. And you know, where James is thinking that Mr. Ramsey is treating them as meaningless. And then James is furious that Mr. Ramsey is inviting McAllister to tell them stories about a storm. I mean, it's just such that there again, you know, I'm back to Harriet's whiplash in terms of James's view of what's happening, what seems to actually be happening, how he wants to interpret everything negatively about his father at the beginning of that, but then their feelings start to change. And what changes them? Sorry, Teresa, I didn't realize your hand was up there.
I do. I'm perplexed by Mr. Ramsey, and I think that ultimately he's been referred to as a play actor, a dramatist. I think in some ways he plays the victim, but I think that he's exceptionally skilled. And again, I haven't read to the end. I'm not a scholar, but I think that he's a manipulator, but yet he's genuine in that manipulation. There's a lot of genuineness when he has a discussion with Mr. McAllister about the big storm. I mean, there's a lot of genuine back and forth, give and take. But again, I'm still perplexed.
Well, and one of the things that the children seem to agree on, though it seems to, in the section we read, not to move ahead, my apologies, but in the section that we read, it's certainly working more on Cam than on James. But there's almost a sense that when Mr. Ramsey rises to the occasion and really engages himself, he's irresistible and he can charm or talk to anyone. But it's when he really brings his energy to focus, as opposed to, you know, kind of wanting to seem pathetic to get Lily's attention, or that somehow or other Lily has an immunity that others don't. But I mean, he can charm the McAllisters when he puts his mind to it. So perhaps next time, because I do see that in my world, it's 7 p.m. In your world, it's now 1 p.m, that we have run out of time. But as we read the last sections of the novel, you know, again, our attention's going to go towards James and Cam and Mr. Ramsey on the boat, and towards Lily, who is back on the island, back in the house, painting. And so perhaps next time we can think about how it is that Woolf brings those together. How does she pull these various strands together in this work of art, in this novel? So thank you all again for just an absolutely fascinating conversation that
And
leaves me
Susan,
thinking about the novel in ways I haven't before. Yes.
Could you tell us what is on tap tonight in London for you?
You know, tonight's going to be a kind of a low-key night for us.
Oh, too bad. I asked the wrong time.
I know, but we do have some wonderful things coming up. We went to see Midsummer Night's Dream at the Globe earlier this week, which was just so much fun. And members of the group are now going out to do we got seats, but members of the Clemson group are going out as groundlings to enjoy Midsummer Night's Dream tonight. And so I think we're going to just indulge in some of the wonderful food that you can have in London. Down the street, there is an Anatolian restaurant that I think we might go to tonight. So, yes.
I love thinking of you there.
Well, I love being here, so thank you. And I do have some photographs that I'll share with you all next week when I can actually get them to load onto my computer from my little London phone. So I'll share some of those with you all next week as we finish the novel. So enjoy Virginia Woolf in her, I think, her brilliance in bringing this novel to a conclusion for us. All right, I'll see you all in a week.
Thank
Ta-ta
you.
for now.